She didn't choose any of this. She was simply told what to do and then treated horribly and then ultimately cast off as a consequence. She likely felt illegitimate, cast off, discarded because she had been. Yet what happens next is such a beautiful picture of the kindness of God and his ability to redeem even the messiest of situations. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I think that we have all been in a place before where we've felt overlooked or discarded or passed over, and that is honestly such a horrible thing to feel. I've felt that before, and probably the most encouraging thing I've learned when I have felt overlooked is that one of God's names literally means the God who sees, or the living one who sees me. Maybe you hear that and you think, great, God sees, but he sees other people. He doesn't see me. I feel forgotten. I feel overlooked. But we're going to look at a Bible story today that shows that it is precisely the people who feel like they're on the outskirts, who feel like they're not a part of the key work that God is doing, who feel pushed aside. It is precisely those people who God goes out of his way to show that he sees. God sees you. And to understand this, to unpack this, we're going to look at a story in Genesis 16 about a woman named Hagar. And then I'm also going to share with you a key verse that you need to know if you are feeling overlooked. And so before we get into it, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and then also give this video a thumbs up if you find it helpful or encouraging. And with that, let's go ahead and take a look at Genesis 16. So before we get into Hagar's part of the story, I'm going to read the beginning part of this chapter so we can understand some of the context as to why Hagar felt overlooked, and not only felt overlooked, but was actually literally discarded. And so Genesis chapter 16, here's what it says. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So backing up a little bit to understand the bigger context of this story, back in Genesis 12, God makes a promise to Abram that he would become a mighty nation. But after that promise is made, Abram goes through years and years and years of waiting, and nothing happens. And he starts to wrestle with doubt, and we get to this point in Genesis 15, the previous chapter, where Abram starts to think, maybe this, lineage is going to come through a member of my household. And so he asks God that, and God says no. He affirms this is going to come through your very own child. So God promises that, and God does not make empty promises. I made an entire video about that. God always keeps his word. And when we can't seem to see how God is going to come through on what he said based off of our circumstances, one of the worst mistakes we can make is to trust the voice of people over the voice of God. And this is what Abram did here. It says in Genesis 16:2, and Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Sarai said, "Take my maidservant, have a child with her, because clearly this ain't happening through us." And it says that Abram listened to Sarai rather than listening to God, who just one chapter earlier had said, "You are going to have your very own son." Little pointer, when something contradicts what God has spoken, it is not the voice of God speaking. So Abram and Sarai don't trust God, and not trusting God leads to chaos. Hagar is now bitter with Sarai that she is pregnant. Sarai is blaming Abram. Abram essentially absolves himself of the matter and tells Sarai to deal with her maidservant how she pleases. And Sarai, who's probably jealous that another woman is now pregnant by her husband, treats her maidservant Hagar horribly, which ultimately causes her to flee. Meanwhile, poor Hagar, she didn't choose any of this. She was simply told what to do and then treated horribly, and then ultimately cast off as a consequence. It could be easy for her to feel like the victim of other people's poor choices, because in a sense she was. It could be easy for her to feel like a mistake because her pregnancy was a deviation from God's original plan for Abram and Sarai to conceive. She likely felt illegitimate, cast off, discarded because she had been. Yet what happens next is such a beautiful picture of the kindness of God and his ability to redeem even the messiest of situations. Picking up in verse 7, it says, "The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?' She said, 'I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel of the Lord also said to her, 'I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude.' And the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen.' So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, 'You are a God of seeing.' For she said, 'Truly here I have seen him who looks after me.' Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram." Now, I think that oftentimes the true remedy our souls need in so many different situations is knowing the character of God. So let's look at how the character of God is revealed to us in this passage. Here are some truths we can see about who God is from this story. 1, God is searching us out. In verse 7, it says, "The angel of the Lord found her." This means that he was looking for her. She was cast off by people. It could have felt like Abram and Sarai didn't care about her, but God cared. He cared enough to go looking for her, to search for her, and he found her. This parallels what we see in so many places in scripture, but I think specifically of Ezekiel 34, where God says, "I myself will seek after my sheep. I will go and look for them and find them," because he is a God who searches us out. 2, God calls us by name. When God finds Hagar in verse 8, it says, "And he said, 'Hagar, servant of Sarai.'" He addresses her by exactly who she is, by name, because he knows her. We see this again several times throughout scripture, but I think specifically of the book of Isaiah, it is reiterated several times, the phrase where God will say, "I have called you by name." I think of Ephesians 3 that says every family on earth is named by God, which means God not only knows your name, but he selected your name. He picked your name and worked through people to bring it about as your name. I have a whole Bible study with me series on Ephesians that I'll have over here linked if you want to check it out. And number 3, he has a plan for our lives. Verse 10, God says to Hagar, "I will surely multiply your offspring." But what's interesting about God's plan for Hagar is this part of his plan for her, the multiplying of her offspring. This part of his plan is good, but there's a lot else in his plan that he reveals to Hagar that doesn't really feel very good. First of all, the first thing he says to her is return to your mistress. Remember, the one who hasn't been treating you well, who has been treating you horribly to the point that you fled. He says return to her and submit to her. And then he also says, okay, you're going to have a lot of offspring, but you're pregnant with a son. His name is Ishmael, and he's going to be a wild donkey of a man, and everyone's going to be against him, and he's going to be against everyone. So a big part of God's plan for Hagar that he reveals to her honestly doesn't feel super encouraging, yet Hagar seems to be at peace with it. And it is after this revealing of the plan that Hagar has this declaration where she cries out God's name and says, "You are the God who sees." And she says, "I have seen in this place him who looks after me." So I think that something we can really glean from Hagar's story and from her response here is that we can have peace in God's plan for our lives when we submit and surrender to the story that he is writing in our lives, even if it's nothing like what we would have imagined for ourselves. God's plan for our lives will almost always undoubtedly involve hardship. Jesus tells us as much when he says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." God's plan for our lives will almost always undoubtedly have things that we wouldn't have chosen for ourselves. Sometimes people will mistreat us. It will not be picture perfect, but it will also not be without purpose. And we can have peace when we rest in that God has intention in the plans that he is bringing about in our lives, and they are never without purpose. He hasn't forgotten us. He sees us. He sees you. He sees me. And he is working in our lives with intention, even if it doesn't look the way that we hoped it would. One last verse I want to read to you to encourage you if you are feeling overlooked, just to be reminded of the character of God. Isaiah 41:9, it says, "But you, whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off." I love the imagery of this verse because it is another reminder of the heart of God, that he's not just focused on the front and center, on what gets the attention of people, but rather he's addressing people who he says he took from the ends of the earth and gathered from its farthest corners. Precisely to those who feel tucked away or overlooked or cast off, precisely to those people he says, "You are my servant and I have chosen you and I have not cast you off. You are a part of my plan. You are a part of my purposes that I am working in this world." I would love to hear from you down in the comments below. What is an area of your life you think that God may be asking you to submit to him in and trust him in, even if it doesn't look how you imagined? I'm going to be sharing my answer to that down in a pinned comment below. I hope that you found this video helpful or encouraging. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.